question the idea of the physical constants being finely tuned. And it's quite true that many scientists, many physicists maintain that the physical constants, the half dozen or so numbers that physicists have to simply assume in order to derive the rest of their understanding, just have to be assumed. You can't provide a rationale for why those numbers are there. And physicists have calculated that if any of these numbers was a little bit different, the universe as we know it wouldn't exist. We wouldn't be here. The universe would perhaps have fizzled out in the first yoctosecond, and so we wouldn't be here, or other things would have gone wrong. It's tempting, once again, to import the easy, facile idea of a designer and to say that the designer twiddled the knobs of the universe at the Big Bang and got them exactly right, got the gravitational constant right, got the strong force right, the weak force right, and so on. But it seems to me to be manifestly obvious that that is a futile kind of explanation because, as the quotation says, who designed the designer? You have explained precisely nothing because instead of just saying, oh, well, the knobs were tuned to the right values anyway, you say, oh, there was a God who knew how to tune the knobs to the right values. And if you're going to postulate that, then you've, in a sense, sold the part.
And Richard Dawkins outlines or summarizes what he calls the central argument of my book. And when you look at this argument, the conclusion to which is, therefore, God almost certainly does not exist, it is a patently logically invalid argument. Even if you grant all 6 steps in the argument, the conclusion that God does not exist doesn't even follow logically from the argument. So it's on its face, it's logically invalid. But when you look at the argument more closely, I think it has a number of premises in it that are false. What are these premises? Well, Dawkins says that you cannot infer a designer of the universe based on the complexity in the universe because this raises a further question, namely, who designed the designer? And that therefore this leaves biological complexity unexplained. Now, this argument on Dawkins' part, I think, is quite inept because philosophers of science recognize that in order to recognize an explanation as the best explanation, you don't have to have an explanation of the explanation. In order to recognize that an explanation is the best, you don't need to have an explanation of the explanation. Let me give you an example. Suppose archaeologists digging in the earth were to come across artifacts looking like arrowheads and pottery shards and tomahawk heads. It would obviously be justifiable to infer that these artifacts were the products of some lost tribe of people, even if the archaeologists had no idea whatsoever who these people were or how they came to be there. Similarly, if astronauts were to discover a pile of machinery on the backside of the moon, they would be justified in inferring that these were the products of intelligent design, even if they had no idea whatsoever where this machinery came from or who put it there. You don't have to have an explanation of the explanation in order to recognize that an explanation is the best. And similarly, in the case of biological complexity, in order to recognize that intelligent design is the best explanation of biological complexity, you don't need to be able to explain the designer. That can be left an open question for future inquiry. So the argument is inept right from the beginning. In fact, when you think about it, if in order to recognize an explanation as the best, you have to have an explanation of the explanation, that leads immediately to an infinite regress. You'd need to have an explanation of the explanation of the explanation, and so on to infinity. You would never have an explanation of anything, which would destroy science. So that Dawkins' principle, if adopted, would actually be completely destructive of science. That's how inept this argument is. So that argument doesn't work. Now, Dawkins goes on to defend the idea that a designer wouldn't be a good explanation because he says the hypothesis of a divine designer is more complex than the world that you're trying to explain. an explanation has to be simpler than the phenomenon you're trying to explain, and he thinks the divine designer is less simple than the world, the universe involving all this complexity. Well, that is completely mistaken. When you reflect on the idea that God is an immaterial entity, a spirit, he is a mind without a body, then God is a remarkably simple entity because he has no parts. There's no composition in God's being. An unembodied mind is an entity that is startlingly simple in its nature. So what Dawkins is obviously confused is a mind's ideas, which may be very complex, with a mind itself, which is a very simple entity. So insofar as you're interested in simplicity, the hypothesis of a divine designer is certainly an advance in simplicity, for what it's worth, over the unexplained, contingent complexity of the universe with all its diversity and variations. So I think that Dawkins' central argument is just hopeless. It is logically invalid on the face of it, and moreover, it's predicated upon premises that I think are clearly false.
That's the wrong number!
It is widely known everywhere outside of the new atheist, Reddit atheist communities, the fact that who created God is one of, if not the worst objection to theism. Yet it is popular on the internet, with new atheists and Reddit atheists being very proud to expound upon that argument, that so-called argument. And it is the central argument in one of their most famous thinkers, Richard Dawkins, in their books, which should really tell you everything you need to know about these type of communities, frankly, the vacuousness of any sort of intellectual considerations. I would like to read to you a few quotes from philosopher Edward Fazer on the topic, and hopefully we'll all gain some insight from it. Quote, "A critic might reasonably question the arguments for a divine first cause of the cosmos, but to ask what caused God misses the whole reason classical philosophers thought his existence necessary in the first place. So, when physicist Lawrence Krauss begins his new book by suggesting that to ask who created the creator suffices to dispatch traditional philosophical theology, we know it isn't going to end well. In general, classical philosophical theology argues for the existence of a first cause of the world, a cause that does not merely happen not to have a cause of its own, but that, unlike everything else that exists, in principle does not require one. Nothing else can provide an ultimate explanation of the world. For Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, for example, things in the world can change only if there is something that changes or actualizes everything else without the need or indeed even the possibility of its being actualized itself, precisely because it is already purely actuality. Change requires an unchangeable changer or unmovable mover. For the Neoplatonists, everything made up of parts can be explained only by reference to something that combines the parts. Accordingly, the ultimate explanation of things must be utterly simple and therefore without the need or even the possibility of being assembled into being by something else. Plotinus calls this the one. For Leibniz, the existence of anything that is in any way contingent can be explained only by its origin in an absolutely necessary being. But Krauss can't see the difference between arguing in favor of an eternally existing creator versus an eternally existing universe without one. The difference, as the reader of Aristotle or Aquinas knows, is that the universe changes while the unmoved mover does not. Or, as the Neoplatonists can tell you, that the universe is made up of parts while its source is absolutely one. Or as Leibniz could tell you, that the universe is contingent and God absolutely necessary. There is thus a principal reason for regarding God rather than the universe as the terminus of the explanations, of all explanations. Okay, end quote. So from this, we can really see how silly it is to consider the argument, if we can even call it that who created God is simply completely just a simple and silly point to consider. Rather than point out some fatal flaw in theism, it simply demonstrates the intellectual immaturity of those who still defend it. Again, it must be said that the reason for this is because that the proponents of classical arguments for God's existence simply do not hold any sort of principle that would entail that God would be caused. So, for example, just a simple premise here, something like everything begins to exist. Someone might ask, well, if everything begins to exist, then what caused God? But the answer to that is precisely that God does not begin to exist. So therefore, God does not need a cause by the very own principle. And so the atheist who asks this not only misunderstands the natural theological arguments, he misunderstands theism as a whole, trying to ground existence itself in something that by negative theology would not entail the sort of circularity that would be entailed by, say, the universe being the candidate for its ultimate source of explanations. So that is why who created God is really a silly argument. So if you like and agree, subscribe for more.